self-contained, that even now, long after many of them have closed, they still seem to hold their breath. At night, they become something else entirely. The last light drains from the sky. A pale fog begins to gather over the grounds. It curls low across dead grass and broken paths, slipping around weeds that push up through cracked paving stones, wrapping itself around benches, boundary walls, and the skeletal remains of old garden rails. Trees, long untended, bend inward like witnesses. Their branches scrape softly against broken panes and loose drain pipes. Somewhere, a sheet of rusted metal knocks faintly in the wind. Then stops. And then there is only the building. Huge. Dark. Watching. The old Victorian walls rise out of the mist with a kind of grim authority, endless red brick stained black by rain, soot, age, and neglect. Even in ruin, they still look disciplined. Imposing. Designed not only to contain bodies, but to overpower minds. Their length alone is unsettling. Block after block. Wing after wing. Rows of tall windows, many now shattered, many boarded, many staring out blank and dark, like empty eye sockets in a face too large to comprehend all at once. The entrance gates are often still there. Iron. Heavy. Ornamental ones, perhaps even grand in their own severe way. But now they hang crooked on their hinges, eaten by rust, flecked with lichen, frozen half open as though whatever passed through them last never meant to return. The gravel drive beyond them is usually swallowed by moss and weeds. And if you stand there long enough, just outside those gates, in the wet cold of evening, you begin to understand something immediately. These places were never built to feel welcoming. They were built to separate. To remove. To keep one world inside, and another world out. And once you cross that threshold, even in imagination, the atmosphere changes. The air feels heavier. The silence changes shape. Because asylum silence is not ordinary silence. It does not feel peaceful. It feels interrupted. As though it exists on top of something else, something buried but not gone. Inside, the corridors stretch on in impossible lengths, dim even in daylight, swallowing sound and giving it back altered. Your footsteps would echo there, then flatten, then disappear. The floors, cracked lino, warped boards, chipped tiles, still remember the movement of thousands of bodies. Nurses hurrying. Orderlies wheeling trolleys. Patients pacing. Patients resisting. Patients being led. Patients being dragged. The sick, the frightened, the medicated, the forgotten. All of them passing under the same gas lamps, later the same electric lights, beneath ceilings now stained with spreading damp and hanging plaster. The walls peel in long curling strips. Paint flakes away from soaked plaster like dead skin. Moisture blooms in dark patches, creeping outward in bruised shapes. In some rooms, the wallpaper still clings on in fragments, floral patterns, institutional greens, faded creams. Ghostly attempts at gentleness in places where gentleness often ran out long before money did. Every surface seems to carry the memory of waiting. And the rooms. The rooms tell their own story. Dormitories where rows of iron bed frames still stand, bent and rusting, their wire springs collapsed inward like rib cages. Mattresses long gone. Blankets long gone. Pillows long gone. But the arrangement remains. Bed after bed after bed, lined with such rigid efficiency that even in emptiness, the room still feels supervised. You can almost picture it too easily. The thin sheets, the cold air, the coughing in the dark, the murmuring, the crying, the sudden screams, the footsteps of night staff approaching from somewhere down the ward. Then there are the side rooms. Observation rooms. Isolation rooms. Rooms with reinforced doors. Rooms where the paint is more scratched near the handle. Rooms where the window opens only a fraction. Rooms that feel smaller than their measurements. And deeper inside, old treatment spaces remain. Tiled, clinical, stripped bare, yet somehow more disturbing than the decayed wards. Rooms where enamel basins once stood. Rooms where instruments were cleaned. Rooms where water treatments were carried out. Rooms where sedation, restraint, examination, and correction all took place under the respectable language of medicine. The walls may be empty now, but emptiness in such places does not calm the imagination. It sharpens it. A rust mark on the floor becomes a question. A drain in the corner becomes a question. A leather strap left in a cupboard becomes a question. A wheeled metal frame left against a wall becomes a question. And perhaps most haunting of all are the records. Not always many. Sometimes just a few scraps. A ledger page. A patient card. A label fallen behind a cabinet. A file cover bloated by damp. Ink faded to brown. Paper turned soft by time. Names half legible. Dates of admission. Age. Condition. Religion. Next of kin. Occupation. Observations written in clipped institutional language. Violent. Melancholic. Delusional. Excitable. Dirty. Unmanageable. Improved. Not improved. Discharged. Transferred. Deceased. A whole human life, reduced to a line. A mind in pain, compressed into a diagnosis. A disappearance documented as paperwork. And in that moment, the building stops being simply eerie. It becomes tragic. Because these were not just abandoned hospitals. They were places where people were taken out of ordinary life and placed somewhere beyond it. Places where time changed meaning. Places where names were replaced by categories. Places where grief, trauma, poverty, disability, illness, and social nonconformity could all be swept together behind one locked door and called, simply, insanity. For thousands upon thousands of men, women, and children in Britain, the asylum was not a brief interruption. It was an erasure. They disappeared from neighborhoods, from village life, from family routines, from workplaces, from parish records of ordinary living. One day they were a daughter, a laborer, a mother, a clerk, a widow, a schoolboy, a servant, a veteran, a sister. Then they became a patient. A case. An inmate. A burden to be managed. A problem transferred from home to institution. And once inside, many would remain there not for days, not for weeks, but for years. Sometimes for decades. Sometimes until death. Families sent relatives away for many reasons. Some did so in desperation, terrified by behavior they could not understand and unequipped to manage. Some hoped, sincerely, that medical treatment might help. Some were told the asylum would provide rest, care, order, food, supervision, safety, and perhaps even recovery. Some believed they were making the only merciful choice available in a society with few real alternatives. But not everyone was sent away because they were violently mad or profoundly unreachable. That is one of the darkest truths in this story. Some were sent because they were poor. Because they were difficult. Because they were traumatized. Because they drank. Because they grieved too loudly or too long. Because they had seizures. Because they could not learn in the expected way. Because they heard voices. Because they frightened their families. Because they had nowhere else to go. Because they were old and confused. Because they were women in distress. Because they were mothers after childbirth. Because they were considered sexually improper. Because they embarrassed someone. Because they resisted someone. Because they did not behave the way society demanded. And sometimes, because they were simply misunderstood in an age that mistook suffering for defect, difference for disorder, and inconvenience for pathology. That is what makes these ruins so disturbing. Not only the scale of them. Not only the architecture. Not only the rumors, the ghost stories, the decayed wards, or the spectacle of ruin. But the knowledge that behind every corridor was a human story, and many of those stories were stories of people who may never have belonged there in the way later memory likes to imagine. The popular image of the asylum is often simple. A place for the dangerously insane. A grim but necessary solution for people beyond the reach of family or society. A dark institution, yes, but somehow inevitable. Somehow separate from ordinary life. The truth is more unsettling than that. Because British asylums were never only medical spaces. They were social spaces. Political spaces. Moral spaces. Economic spaces. They were built under the language of care, but they were also shaped by fear, fear of disorder, fear of dependency, fear of unpredictability, fear of those who did not fit neatly into the rhythms and values of respectable society. Officially, they were places of refuge and treatment. Places where disturbed minds could be soothed by routine, quiet, fresh air, useful work, and medical supervision. That was the promise. And to be fair, in their earliest vision, some reformers did genuinely believe they were creating something more humane than the brutality that had come before. Compared with chains, cells, neglect in poorhouses, and public spectacle, the asylum could be presented as progress. Order instead of chaos. Treatment instead of punishment. Shelter instead of abandonment. But history has a way of exposing the distance between promise and practice. Because behind those promises of protection and care, another reality grew. One of overcrowding. Neglect. Confinement. Control. Forced labor disguised as therapy. Punishment disguised as management. Silence disguised as order. And suffering disguised as treatment. The asylum system in Britain did not become dark merely because a few cruel people worked inside it. It became dark because the institution itself carried a dangerous contradiction at its heart. It claimed to heal, but it also existed to remove. It claimed to protect, but it also existed to contain. It claimed to treat, but it also existed to discipline. And once a place is built both to care for people and to hide them, the line between medicine and social control can become terrifyingly thin. Some asylums were undoubtedly better than others. Some staff were humane. Some doctors were earnest. Some patients did improve. Some families found relief. Some lives may even have been saved by admission. This history is not simple enough to reduce to one note, one slogan, or one image. But neither can it be softened. Because many asylums became vast human warehouses, places where lives were not restored, but managed into stillness. Places where distress was processed bureaucratically. Places where unwanted people could be absorbed by a system large enough to outlast scrutiny and quiet enough to swallow protest. That is why these buildings still grip the imagination. That is why they remain so hard to look away from. Even now, when many have been demolished, redeveloped, converted into flats, or left to rot behind security fencing, old British asylums continue to exert a strange power over public memory. Photographers seek them out. Urban explorers break into them. Paranormal investigators whisper into their corridors. Historians dig through their archives. Local residents swap stories about lights in empty wards, cries heard through broken windows, shadows at upper floors where no one lives anymore. It is tempting to say these places are haunted. And perhaps, in the cultural imagination, they are. But maybe not in the way ghost stories usually mean. Maybe what haunts them is not an apparition in white at the end of a corridor. Maybe it is the scale of what happened there. Maybe it is the suspicion that entire populations were hidden away in plain sight. Maybe it is the knowledge that these institutions were not medieval oddities or ancient castles from some barbaric era far removed from us. Many stood well into living memory. Many operated deep into the 20th century. Some were still shaping lives at a time close enough to touch the present. And that means the darkness attached to them is not safely distant. It belongs to modern Britain too. That is what gives these ruins their emotional weight. They are not just dead architecture. They are monuments to a hidden national trauma. Great physical reminders of a society that built enormous systems to classify suffering, isolate it, and manage it behind walls so high that the rest of the country could go on pretending those inside had simply gone somewhere necessary. Stand before one of these buildings long enough and it begins to raise uncomfortable questions. What really happened inside these institutions? What did admission feel like for the person arriving at those gates, frightened, confused, perhaps sedated, perhaps pleading, perhaps too exhausted to resist? What did the first night feel like? What did the first locked door sound like? What did it mean to realize that your words might no longer be trusted because they came from your mouth? How many people were helped there, and how many were broken there? How many suffered from illnesses no one yet understood? How many were punished for symptoms? How many were condemned not by madness alone, but by poverty, gender, stigma, class prejudice, bureaucracy, and convenience? Why did some never come out? Why are so many stories still fragmented, hidden in ledgers, or buried beneath official phrases that reveal almost nothing about the terror, grief, humiliation, or loneliness of life inside? And why, after closure, after demolition, after redevelopment, after the weeds have taken the paths and the rain has stained the brick and the windows have gone blind, do these places still provoke such dread? Why do they still seem to radiate something more than decay? Why do they feel less like empty buildings, and more like evidence? Perhaps because that is what they are. Evidence that care can become control. Evidence that institutions built in the name of mercy can, over time, become engines of silence. Evidence that societies often reveal their deepest fears not in the people they celebrate, but in the people they hide. And in Britain, the asylum became one of the most powerful machines ever built for doing exactly that. Tonight, in this story, we are going to walk slowly back through those gates. Not to sensationalize these places. Not to flatten them into ghost attractions. Not to pretend that every doctor was a monster or every patient an innocent victim of conspiracy. But to examine, carefully and honestly, the dark side of British asylums. The side written not in official speeches, but in overcrowded wards, treatment rooms, locked doors, censored letters, exhausted staff, forgotten graves, and lives that disappeared into institutional time. We are going to trace how the asylum system rose across Britain. Why it expanded so rapidly. What social anxieties helped build it. Why the language of care was so often intertwined with the logic of control. We are going to look at the brutal mechanics of the asylum system. How people were categorized, certified, admitted, separated from their homes, and absorbed into systems that could be almost impossible to leave. We are going to step inside the wards themselves. Into the routines of waking, washing, queuing, working, eating, waiting, being observed, being corrected, and trying, somehow, to retain a private self in a place designed to reduce private selves into orderly populations. We are going to look closely at women in asylums. Women whose grief, rage, defiance, sexuality, breakdown, and postpartum suffering were often interpreted through the narrow and deeply gendered assumptions of their time. We are going to look at children too, and at those labeled defective, feeble-minded, unteachable, or unfit, lives shaped from an early age by institutional language that did not merely describe difference, but imprisoned it. We are going to examine the treatments that defined asylum medicine at different moments in history. From restraint and seclusion to hydrotherapy, sedation, and more invasive interventions that promised relief but often inspired fear. We are going to confront punishment as well as treatment. Neglect as well as care. The ways discipline could masquerade as therapy. The ways routine could become a weapon. The ways silence could be mistaken for improvement simply because it made a ward easier to manage. We are going to explore scandals, investigations, abuse, overcrowding, and death. The long shadow of institutions where too many people live too close together, under too little supervision, with too little voice, and with far less dignity than official records like to suggest. We are going to visit some of the most infamous British asylums and psychiatric institutions, places whose names still echo through medical history, tabloid fear, local folklore, and the architecture of memory itself. We are going to ask how public attitudes began to shift. How the Great Asylum age declined. Why these giant institutions were eventually criticized, emptied, closed, and in many cases left behind as hulks of brick and silence. And finally, we are going to ask why they still frighten people now. Why old asylum buildings remain among the most unsettling ruins in Britain. Why they attract urban legends, ghost stories, and a kind of fascination that never quite goes away. Because maybe the fear is not really about spirits. Maybe the fear comes from recognizing something painfully human in these ruins. The fear of being disbelieved. The fear of being labeled. The fear of being removed. The fear of being shut away where suffering continues, but language no longer reaches it. And the deepest fear of all. That a society can convince itself it is being compassionate, even while it is quietly burying people alive in bureaucracy, routine, and walls. So before we go any further, hold the image in your mind. A cold British night. Fog creeping low over abandoned grounds. Towering Victorian brickwork blackened by time. Iron gates hanging open. Windows staring out, broken and blind. Corridors stretching into dark. Paint peeling from damp walls. Rusted bed frames. Old treatment rooms. A patient ledger soft with age. A silence so deep it does not feel empty, only watchful. And ask yourself, what kind of nation builds places like these? What kind of age fills them? What kind of suffering disappears inside them? And what, exactly, never left? This is the dark side of British asylums. And the buildings, even now, have stories to tell. Before the asylum, how Britain treated madness. Before the great Victorian asylums rose across Britain, before the long brick corridors, the iron bedsteads, the locked wards, the patient ledgers, and the enormous institutional cemeteries, there was already fear. Fear of the mind that would not behave. Fear of the voice that spoke to no visible person. Fear of grief that became too wild, too loud, too prolonged. Fear of a woman who collapsed after childbirth and no longer seemed to know herself. Fear of an old man wandering confused through the lane at dusk, unable to remember where he lived. Fear of a young laborer shattered by trauma, drink, or despair, shouting in the street or weeping in a field. Fear, too, of what could not easily be named. Because for most of British history, what we now call mental illness was not understood in anything like a modern medical sense. There was no shared, reliable framework for separating psychosis from dementia, trauma from possession, epilepsy from spiritual attack, postpartum psychosis from moral failing, learning disability from insanity, depression from laziness, neurological decline from divine punishment. Instead, all kinds of suffering, emotional, cognitive, behavioral, neurological, spiritual, social, were often swept together beneath loose, shifting words. Madness. Lunacy. Melancholy. Distraction. Frenzy. Idiocy. Possession. Disorder. These were not neat categories. They were unstable labels applied in a world where medicine, religion, superstition, morality, and social order overlapped constantly. In early modern and pre-modern Britain, strange behavior was rarely seen as a purely clinical issue. It could be interpreted as sin, as punishment, as temptation, as bodily imbalance, as weak character, as grief, as divine trial, as witchcraft, as evidence that reason, understood as the foundation of human dignity and moral self-command, had somehow been overthrown. And because people did not agree on what madness truly was, they also did not agree on what should be done with those who seemed to have lost control of their minds. Some were pitied. Some were feared. Some were mocked. Some were beaten. Some were hidden away. Some were tolerated so long as they remained quiet, familiar, and close to home. Some were dragged into church for prayer. Some were handed over to local authorities. Some were allowed to wander until they became impossible to ignore. That uncertainty, that inability to clearly distinguish illness from sin, distress from deviance, impairment from danger, is where the story of British asylums really begins. Not with the buildings. Not with the Victorian state. But with a much older social instinct. The instinct to contain what disturbs the social eye. To explain it. To moralize it. To push it somewhere else when explanation fails. If you go far enough back into British history, what later centuries would call mental disturbance was often filtered first through religion. In a deeply Christian society, the behavior of the mind was tied closely to the condition of the soul. A person hearing voices, speaking incoherently, raging without clear cause, collapsing into terror, sinking into blank despair, or behaving in bizarre and frightening ways might be understood not as someone with a psychiatric condition, but as someone under spiritual pressure. Perhaps they were being tested by God. Perhaps punished. Perhaps tempted by the devil. Perhaps weakened by sin. Perhaps their reason, that prized human faculty, had been overrun by darker forces. This did not always mean people were treated as monsters. Religious frameworks could produce compassion as well as fear. A suffering person might be seen as afflicted rather than evil. Prayer, fasting, confession, scriptural comfort, and pastoral care could all be offered. Families and clergy might try to interpret mental breakdown as part of a larger spiritual drama, painful but meaningful. But this same framework could also harden suffering into suspicion. If behavior seemed too strange, too disruptive, too blasphemous, too sexual, too violent, too resistant to prayer, then the afflicted person could start to look less like someone in pain and more like a threat to moral order. And moral order mattered intensely. In villages, towns, and parishes, life depended on predictability. People were expected to know their place, perform their role, observe custom, and maintain the rhythms of labor, worship, family, and local reputation. A person whose mind seemed to wander outside those rhythms could unsettle far more than one household. They could disturb an entire local world. That is why the mad were never treated in one single way. A harmless village eccentric might be tolerated. A grieving widow who muttered to herself might be watched with pity. A confused old person might be cared for by relatives until the burden became unbearable. But a person who shouted in public, stripped naked, smashed windows, threatened neighbors, spoke of devils, refused food, wandered endlessly, or disrupted worship could quickly become a communal problem. And once someone became a communal problem, the language surrounding them changed. They were no longer merely suffering. They were troublesome, scandalous, disorderly, dangerous. There was, at this stage, no modern psychiatric map to separate one condition cleanly from another. A single catch-all word could contain widely different realities. People suffering from trauma after violence or war might be grouped with those experiencing severe psychosis. A woman shattered by childbirth could be classed alongside someone with lifelong developmental impairment. An elderly person with dementia might be treated as though they were morally erratic. Someone having seizures could be feared as unstable or uncanny. A person with syphilitic brain disease, a person in deep depression, a person with autism, a person in delirium from fever, a person hearing voices, and a person drunk beyond reason might all be described using overlapping terms of madness or lunacy because society lacked better distinctions, and often lacked the will to make them. This is one of the most important things to understand before the asylum age. When older Britain spoke of madness, it was often talking about many different things at once. And that meant the response to madness was often improvised, inconsistent, and deeply shaped by class, family resources, local custom, and social tolerance. Long before vast state institutions, the first place where mental distress was usually handled was the home. The household was the original asylum in the broadest sense of the word. Not an institution, but a place of shelter, supervision, endurance, and sometimes imprisonment. Families carried the burden first. They watched. They interpreted. They hid. They soothed. They restrained. They prayed. They waited for improvement. And sometimes they simply endured for as long as they could. In wealthier homes, there might be more space, more privacy, more servants, more ability to keep suffering out of public view. A disturbed relative could be tucked away in an upper room, cared for by kin or attendants, protected from spectacle, and managed with the family's reputation still largely intact. But for the poor, Privacy was a luxury. A cramped cottage, a single room, a crowded lodging house, a house full of children, illness, labor, and hunger. These were not environments where prolonged mental crisis could be contained gently. When one person's behavior became unpredictable, the whole household could tip into instability. Sleep vanished. Neighbors noticed. Employers complained. Children were frightened. Rent went unpaid. Food ran short. Violence, self-harm, or wandering became harder to prevent. Poor families were expected to care, but often without the means to do so. And in that gap between expectation and possibility, the darker side of community care emerged. Because care in pre-asylum Britain could be compassionate, but it could also be brutal. Some relatives protected vulnerable family members for years, shielding them from public ridicule and doing what they could with almost no support. There are stories, scattered across records and recollections, of immense patience, sacrifice, and tenderness. A mother sitting through the night with a son in delirium. Sisters washing and feeding a confused father. Neighbors keeping an eye on a harmless wanderer known to the parish. Clergy or local women offering practical help to mothers in mental distress. But there are other stories too. Stories of confinement in back rooms. Of ropes. Of beatings. Of neglect so deep it became indistinguishable from abandonment. Of family shame turning into family cruelty. Of people chained to furniture, locked in outbuildings, left filthy, mocked by children, feared by neighbors, spoken about as though they were no longer fully human. That is the danger of romanticizing the period before asylums. The absence of large institutions did not mean humane freedom. Very often it meant that suffering remained private until it became intolerable, and private suffering can become invisible for a very long time. When families could no longer cope, or would no longer cope, the person at the center of distress might drift outward into other systems of control. The parish. The poorhouse. The workhouse. The prison. The street. Because before the asylum became the dominant answer, Britain dealt with mental disturbance partly by scattering it across institutions never designed to heal the mind. Some wandered the roads and market streets, surviving on charity, mockery, alms, or theft. To later romantic imagination, the wandering mad person can appear almost folkloric, the muttering figure at the village edge, the half-known local oddity, the poor distracted soul. But the real experience was often harsh. Exposure. Hunger. Humiliation. Assault. Arrest. Winter cold. Public cruelty. There was little dignity in being tolerated only because no one had yet found a cheaper way to remove you. Others entered parish care, where support depended heavily on local willingness and resources. Relief might mean small payments, food, temporary shelter, or ad hoc supervision. In some communities, this could amount to a rough form of practical compassion. In others, it barely disguised neglect. And many ended up in workhouses or prisons. That fact matters enormously. Because before the 19th century asylum boom, mental disorder was often handled not as a specialized medical issue, but as part of the broader problem of poverty and disorder. If someone could not support themselves, frightened others, disrupted labor, or behaved unpredictably, they could be pulled into the same punitive welfare structures used to manage the poor more generally. The National Archives notes that records of mental health in Britain overlap heavily with those of asylums, workhouses, and other institutions, reflecting how blurred these categories once were. The workhouse in particular sits at the dark edge of this story. Workhouses were not created to provide mental health care. They were instruments of poor relief, discipline, and deterrence. Their purpose was to house the destitute under conditions deliberately harsh enough to discourage dependence. To place mentally ill, cognitively impaired, confused, or traumatized people into that environment was to treat suffering as one more form of social burden. The person in distress was no longer just unwell or afflicted. They were poor, unproductive, dependent, costly, and prisons were no better. To be jailed while mentally disturbed, for vagrancy, outbursts, nuisance, disorder, or petty crime born of confused survival was to have your suffering read not as illness but as deviance. Noise, hallucination, panic, confusion, resistance, in a prison context, all could be answered with more force, more isolation, and more punishment. This is part of why later reformers could convincingly present asylums as humanitarian progress. Compared with the family attic, the parish lockup, the workhouse ward, or the jail cell, a dedicated institution for the mad could sound civilized. That was the brilliance of the argument. And also the danger. Because it made the system appear compassionate, even when it was also convenient. No institution captures the old chaos, cruelty, fascination, and spectacle of British madness more powerfully than Bethlem Royal Hospital. Better known to history and legend by the name that became a byword for disorder itself. Bedlam. Even the word survives as accusation and metaphor. Noise. Confusion. Uproar. Loss of control. That alone tells you something about the place Bethlem came to occupy in British cultural memory. Bethlem began centuries before the great Victorian county asylums. Its long history makes it one of the most infamous institutions connected to mental disturbance in Europe. And over time, it became more than a hospital. It became a symbol. A stage on which society rehearsed its attitudes toward madness. Fear, curiosity, revulsion, pity, amusement, superiority, and moral reassurance all tangled together. Public visiting at Bethlem is well documented. By the 18th century, visitors were permitted onto the wards, and the hospital gained notoriety as a place where outsiders came to gawp at patients. Pause there for a second, because the fact is so grotesque it deserves to be felt. People came to look. Not doctors only. Not relatives only. Spectators. Visitors. Onlookers. Human beings in pain were turned into an attraction. A day out. A cautionary tableau. A living exhibition of broken reason. The paying public, or those expected to donate, could walk through and observe those confined inside, staring at the distressed, the incoherent, the agitated, the visibly unwell. Some came for entertainment. Some for morbid curiosity. Some perhaps told themselves they came for moral instruction, to see what happened when reason failed, when vice prevailed, when the human mind descended into chaos. But whatever justifications were offered, the effect was the same. Madness became spectacle. And spectacle always creates distance. The viewer stands safely outside the suffering. The person observed becomes object. A warning. A curiosity. A grotesque. Not a fellow citizen whose mind is in torment, but an example of otherness. Something to marvel at, recoil from, or laugh at. Bethlem's public culture helped harden that social divide between normal society and the institutionalized. It reassured visitors of their own sanity by putting another person's distress on display. This is not merely a sensational footnote in the history of one notorious hospital. It reveals something much larger about Britain before the asylum age fully matured. Madness was not only feared. It was also watched. Talked about. Performed around. Used as moral theatre. People looked at the mad to confirm the value of reason, restraint, social discipline, and proper conduct. In that sense, Bedlam was not outside society at all. It was one of the ways society explained itself to itself. There, behind the walls, was the opposite of order. And out here, among the visitors, was order confirmed. That is how stigma deepens. Not only by cruelty, but by ritualized distance. By making sure one group is seen as fundamentally unlike the other. And once that distance exists, confinement becomes easier to justify. As Britain moved toward the 18th and 19th centuries, the wider social landscape was changing fast. Population grew. Towns expanded. Villages fed cities. The rhythms of older local life were strained by mobility, poverty, wage labor, enclosure, industrial growth, and the hard new pressures of urban existence. The crowded city altered everything. In a small rural community, strange behavior might remain partly known, partly absorbed, however uneasily, into local familiarity. Everyone knew whose son he was, whose widow she was, which family had trouble in it. Eccentricity, confusion, and low-level disorder could sometimes be folded into community memory. But the city was less forgiving. In crowded urban environments, distress became more visible and less personal. A shouting man in a narrow lane, a woman in clear breakdown on a busy street, a confused elder wandering traffic, a person sleeping rough and speaking to unseen figures, these were no longer simply local family tragedies. They became elements of public disorder. And the more cities swelled, the more elites, officials, reformers, magistrates, and moral commentators worried about the visible signs of instability. Crime, vagrancy, idleness, dependency, begging, drunkenness, disease, sexual impropriety, public disturbance. In that anxious atmosphere, insanity began to look less like a mysterious misfortune affecting isolated individuals and more like a category within a larger problem: how to manage the unstable poor in a rapidly changing society. That shift is crucial, because once insanity becomes a public problem, it invites public systems. Not just sympathy, not just prayer. Administration, inspection, classification, removal, control. Britain's growing urban poverty did not create mental illness, of course. But it changed how mental disturbance was seen. Crowded conditions intensified stress and breakdown. Economic precarity increased family desperation. Public visibility made non-conforming behavior harder to ignore. And social reformers, even when sincerely motivated, often approached the problem through the language of order as much as care. The distressed poor were not seen only as sufferers. They were also seen as populations. Numbers. Cases. Burdens on parishes. Sources of nuisance. Potential dangers. People needing to be placed somewhere. Once that logic takes hold, the road toward the asylum becomes much clearer. Not because everyone suddenly grows cruel, but because the institution begins to solve multiple social problems at once. It promises treatment for the afflicted, relief for families, safety for the public, administrative clarity for authorities, and physical removal of troubling sights from everyday life. That is a very powerful mix. Historic England notes that by the early 19th century the asylum was increasingly framed as a more humane, organized response, with legislation from 1808 and especially 1845 accelerating the spread of county asylums for pauper lunatics. But the seeds of that transition lay earlier, in this growing conviction that older arrangements, the home, the parish, the workhouse, the jail, the street, were inadequate for managing mental disorder in a rapidly modernizing society. And so the idea began to harden. There should be special places for such people. Separate places. Controlled places. Purpose-built places. Places away from the street.